One item that every pilot is concerned about is maintaining their medical certificate. We are pleased that First Officer Ellen Brinks, ALPA's Aeromedical Chair, has been able to assemble a panel of aeromedical specialists from the FAA, along with our very own ALPA aeromedical consultants for the US and Canada. They will walk us through how aeromedical policies are evolving now and in the future. Welcome. Elle.
Well, good morning, everyone. I would like to introduce you to Maintaining Your Medical Certification, our panel this morning. So I am Ellen Brinks, the National Aeromedical Chair for the Air Safety Organization and a Delta 330 pilot out of New York. So anyways, on this panel, we're going to be discussing how to maintain your medical certification and different various issues that have popped up throughout the year or been ongoing in the past few years. We'll talk a little bit about some mental health topics, but because we have a mental health panel just after this, we're going to save majority of the mental health topics for that panel. And I would encourage you to stay for that. So, joining me this morning, I have our Dr. Daniel Danzig for the FAA and Dr. Quay Snyder from Aviation Medical Advisory Service, as well as Dr. James Daniel, our Canadian Aeromedical Support Director. So thank you very much for joining me today, gentlemen. And without further ado, I will tell you that their apps they all have extensive resumes and CVs, and so I would like to tell you to look in the app for their bios as well. But and to tell you also that we have unfortunately not been able to, Dr. Tyler Brooks of Transport Canada was not able to attend this morning, so he does send his regards, and hopefully we're able to get him back here next year. So now, normally, with this being said, our medical is one of those things that we think about because we all like to keep our job being a pilot. And that's when we worry about it, is about the day the month of the medical is due. And with that, we've got our ability to fly our aircraft, its certification and everything. And what I'd like to do is discuss some of the various issues that come up when things don't go according to plan. In the aeromedical world, we do say that it's not a matter of if you have a medical issue, it's a matter of when you have one. They're more likely to come up as you get older, right? We're all experiencing that. So what I'd like to do now is just discuss a couple of our special issuance questions. So we'll start with that. So Dr. Danzig, could you tell us, can you just give us a quick explanation of what a special issuance is? Because for most pilots, they walk in to their AME and they walk out with a medical a few minutes later. So could you tell us what a special issuance is for our pilots that are not familiar?
Sure. I mean, as everybody knows, when you go into an AME, if an AME issues it to you, that didn't require a special issuance. They were able to issue, even if you had certain conditions, they could issue. But in the cases that AME would defer it to the FAA, that would require some type of special waiver, which we consider a special issuance for. So certain conditions require basically essentially a special waiver. Only the federal air surgeon is authorized to provide that special waiver. And the name special issuance is just what we call it.
Yeah, and for some of you, if you've received a letter in the mail and it says, we are not able to certify you under this part of the federal aviation regulations. However, due to this, we are able to, these authorizations, this exception, here's a waiver. So with that being said, could you tell us how the protocols are actually developed for a special issuance example? Let's say, for instance, something in a cardiac. There's been a lot of cardiac cases that have come up recently. So how do they develop the protocols? And because medicine is so rapidly evolving as well. So how do you keep up with that? And
the process actually is going through experts in the field that meet on a periodic basis, and they look at the conditions and they look at the current medical literature and they see what is the information we need for this, and is that something that we can now turn into something that maybe the AME can issue with certain criteria, or is it something that still requires a special waiver, the special issuance? and what that criteria would be, and revising that criteria over time.
So with the experts, are those, can I ask you then with that, are the experts considered the ones that primarily will treat a certain disease? Because for instance, there's different variations and of all the different diagnoses for cardiac as well as for, cancer and things of that nature. So do you go and find a specialist specifically for a certain type of disease, or is it more just a wide variety?
It's both, but yes, we'll look to, depending on the condition, we'll look to the experts in that field, so that not uncommonly may require going outside of the FAA and finding that expert opinion.
Okay.
And looking at multiple experts and consensus.
Okay. And can I ask you one last question about this? Because with cardiac, there has been some recent changes. We got a lot of complaints and pushback from pilots as well as from the insurance companies, because one of the things that the FAA deemed necessary in the treatment of any sort of heart issue was you need to go get a stress test, or you need to get these tests. And a lot of the cardiac specialists are saying, no, that test is not a great idea for you to get. This is dangerous. How do we go about this? Because we couldn't get it approved for them to go actually even get their insurance to cover it. So could you tell us some of the changes that have been made?
So it's my understanding, talking with Dr. Northup, that is a significant change. They re-looked at that, and not all cases now require that stress test. So that's one of those instances. And I think she's also looked at pushback on why 90 days after an ablation. Why does it have to be 90 days? Could it be different?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of progress made down here south of the borders, so.
Yeah, we're currently undergoing right now a huge color vision changes, so we're looking at outside experts at that. We have internal ophthalmologists as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I'd like to ask Dr. Snyder now, if you don't mind. You support a lot of our pilots all within the U.S. In relation to submitting their paperwork to the FAA if they do have a deferral or if they're on a special issuance. So in the past, we've talked about some of the processing times. And there's rough estimates, like we could say that I'll pick on cardiac again, just that's in the forefront. That one takes you see roughly about 3 to 4 months as a turnaround for the processing of paperwork. Once it's actually submitted and you complete your grounding time for whatever the wait time is for a procedure you've had done. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, for the cardiac cases, certainly there's some variability depending on the diagnosis and the procedure. But in general, we're looking at several months to get through, particularly if a case needs to go in front of the FAA cardiac panel, which are primarily the revascularization cases or pacemakers.
Yeah. And here's another thing. There is a wide variety in paperwork processing time. So could you give us, let's start with the extremes. What's the shortest turnaround time you've seen as well as the longest?
Well, if I can rephrase the question, I think it'll be a little more helpful.
Okay.
A lot depends on the rigor of the pilot and the pilot's physician obtaining the appropriate documentation. And the FAA has made some great strides even since the ARC in delineating exactly what documentation is required for a whole host of conditions, not just cardiac, but the entire spectrum. And if a pilot or the pilot's physician and the pilot's AME are willing to collect that paperwork according to the protocol, then the FAA has the material it needs to make a decision the first time they touch that paperwork. The biggest holdup in my mind is submission of incomplete paperwork, and that results in the pilot getting a request for information letter, the dreaded RFI letter. We don't have current information, and so you go back to the end of the queue after you submit that. So with that being said, I think a good relationship with the AME is absolutely essential, because if you have an AME who will diligently follow and is knowledgeable about what the FAA protocols are prior to submitting that, or through our office, we do the same thing, submitted on behalf of the pilot, and I'm sure that James does the same thing, then I think it goes through quickly. There are some conditions that take a very long period of time right now, and I'm sure Dr. Danzig will talk a little bit about the antidepressant protocols too. But the other area where we're seeing long turnaround times are the neurologic injury type things, strokes, traumatic brain injury, concussions, et cetera. And those seem to take quite a bit of time, and it may be because of the resources that the FAA has to dedicate to review of those cases and the protocols which require certain waiting periods.
Yeah, you know, and to kind of dovetail off of that, I will say that the FAA has changed some of their policy for neurology as well. Could you give us the variety of times that pilots could expect to wait? For instance, like, oh, I'm throwing you a curveball. But
No softballs.
no, well, you've done this for so long. No, but they've just recently changed their protocols, so there's different variations of wait times dependent on what has happened to you from a neurology respect. So could you explain a little bit about that?
Without going into the details
The
of
entire,
each, because
yeah.
each case is dependent on the circumstances of that individual case. But on the short end, someone can slip and fall and hit their head, but no real loss of consciousness or anything, and the AME can clear the person to go back quickly. There are other conditions where it may require 6 months with a more severe period of amnesia or loss of consciousness. Some will require 2 years, particularly some strokes. If you can't determine a cause, seizures will take a longer period of time, 4 years in one case with a single seizure, up to 10 years with another seizure. That's not the processing time, that's the observation time.
Correct.
And then major head injuries such as fracture of the skull that penetrates into the brain, or bleeding into the brain, or a tumor within the brain as opposed to around it. Then we're looking at least 5 years for the pilot to be out. But it really is dependent on the actual pathology, the circumstances that are there. So I'm reluctant to give you set numbers.
Yeah, no, and that's very true, and not to sound like, the FAA, but it depends.
It depends. It really does depend.
There is a lot of gray area, though. No, it's very true. So, Dr. Daniel, welcome to the panel. This is your first time here.
Thank you.
Yeah, you just joined representing our Canadian pilots, so thank you for that. Could you tell us a little bit about your role in Canada to support all of our pilots up there? What you're hoping to achieve, or what your goal is?
Yeah. So, due to some of the requirements north of the border, we had to fashion a unique program, slightly different from what you have here, primarily due to the legality of some of the things we deal with, and mainly the reporting component as well. So the first part was building a short-term program to actually address and be able to have our pilot group directly interact with the healthcare system, specifically physicians such as myself. And the longer-term program was to look at a preventative health model and some data generation for other uses in the long run for pilot health, for no better word.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, let me ask you, because we've talked about kind of the processing and how it works in the U.S. Could you explain what the process is for the medical certification within Canada as well? Because you were a CAMI as well, correct?
That's right. So it's fundamentally the same. There's some form of interaction with an AME. The primary difference in Canada is on initial medical, it has to go up to the Transport Canada level, while at the FAA level, we can issue the medical on the spot. And that's really the fundamental difference, and probably one of the barriers to our delays as well, is that everything's being funneled up and bottlenecked as opposed to spread out.
Do you think that that's like one of the initial obstacles then, just because every first application of a medical has to be reviewed by Transport Canada?
It's probably a component of it, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think that that is possibly changing or impacting their processing times? Or
Yeah.
what if you had to define, if you
Yeah.
could give us a range of processing times for Transport Canada?
It's completely unpredictable, to be honest with you. However, lately it's been getting fairly quick, so there's a positive trend for sure. The bigger issue that we have is anytime you do an ECG, an audiogram, an ancillary test like a stress test, you're dipping into the Canadian healthcare system. So that can take many, many months to get a simple test done, 3 to 6 months. So often that's the bigger rate limiting step. And if it's a complex case, as Quay talked about, there's a lot of review done at a higher level. And, their goal is to have you flying. So it requires a lot of scrutiny and a lot of time. So dipping into the Canadian healthcare system is probably one of the key rate limiting steps.
Okay, so you have the same issues as us in the US then? He's like, he doesn't want to say it, so I'll say it. No, okay, well, with that being said, Dr. Danzig, could you tell us one of the great things that I think has been, and it was a recommendation in the FAA mental health ARC as well, but one of the things that has come out and really improved over time has been the Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners. Could you, for some of those that don't know what it is, could you explain just a quick little brief about what that is and how it's used?
Sure. The AME guide is it's basically a manual that we use for guidance to aviation medical examiners on all sorts of conditions and pathologies.
Okay. Yeah, and it's perfect. And I didn't even realize this. Quay, when did you start? You said when you started it was like 200 pages, and now to give you an idea of how much they have expanded the guidance that's out there, it's up to 900 pages. Literally, you can download it. Every month it gets updated on the last Wednesday of every month. And what's great for our pilots, they don't even know if you have some sort of medical issue, you can go in there, type in the disease that you're diagnosed with, and go, oh, do I need to bring in any extra paperwork or get any tests done for when I go to see my medical examiner? And it'll tell you all. So with that being said, for some people, I could read that or at least call a doctor's office and be like, hey, I need to get this test done. So is there something that's coming out that pilots could use?
Not that I'm aware of. In that way. We've been talking about doing something that's much, much shorter.
Okay.
But the challenge, as you just stated, is taking maybe some of that and taking it to your local doctor, because it's a lot of medical lingo, right? How do we take that and then update something like that for non-physicians on a regular basis?
Yeah.
Right? That's the challenge. We're trying to figure out how to get around that. Maybe to have something that's still comprehensive enough that refers to parts of the AME guide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ella, if
That's
I
been a
might-
legitimate ask, right? Having something like that. I mean, I think EASA has something like that as well. So.
Yeah. And Quay,
Well,
you
if I can add to that, one of the recommendations from the mental health ARC was to try to make the documentation that the FAA makes available interpretable not only clearly to the AMEs, but also to treating physicians and presumably to the pilots too. And Dan hasn't taken credit for some of the things he's done already, but there are checklists there right now. And if you have certain criteria, you can have your treating physician check yes or no, yes or no. And if all of the check marks are in the appropriate column, then the authority to issue that certificate now moves to the AME rather than going to the Air Medical Certification Division. And that serves to unclog the system that's there and reduce the backlog. So, Dan, take some credit for the good work you've done there.
Well, I mean, we are starting to see AMEs use some of those decision tools in the way he just described.
Okay.
Handing that decision tool to the airman to take to their primary care physician or therapist.
Yeah.
It didn't used to be that case, but so we didn't necessarily tell AMEs that they're doing that on their own, and it's successful.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you, being myself on a special issuance, I print out the page, I send it to my doctor's office, and I go, hey, I need all of the information that's required in this so that I can bring it in for my medical. And then I walk out typically with my medical.
But I mean, getting to the heart of it, what you were saying, it's about health literacy, right? How do we direct a pilot or their primary care physician or a specialist involved in the care to know exactly what it is we want to say in the workup? That's always has been a big challenge.
Yeah.
And when pilots contact our office, we send them copies of the checklist, along with the checklist what to do, and I'm sure you're doing the same thing.
Well, one of our rate limiting steps is there's a big asymmetry of information where we at the AME level don't have that, but transport does. And because they're going through a number of changes right now and updating the standards, which are not approved by Parliament officially, they can't actually post it publicly. So the pilots are caught off guard, we're caught off guard, and then all of a sudden you get a letter from Transport Canada. And so that's one thing we're trying to work through, is getting that information out. The FAA is exceptionally good. Yeah.
There, you heard it here, folks. No, well, so Quay, I think one of the things that we have alluded to is the processing times. Could you tell us, you mentioned the request for information letter. Could you tell us, because I've got a lot of recent complaints from pilots about, hey, what is this RFI letter? What do I need to do with this? Could you tell us, are you seeing more of those come through your office? Like, are pilots calling you about that because they're getting those letters, or?
Yes, we are. And it's primarily because of the backlog of cases, both at the Air Medical Certification Division, also sometimes at headquarters too. The FAA considers information current if the evaluation is done within the last 90 days when they do the review. So a pilot and his or her AME may submit the information on a timely basis, but because of the backlog and the resource limitations that the FAA has, they can't review it on that timely basis. So by the time it ends up in a FAA physician's hands or queue, the information may be more than 90 days old, and then they're required to request additional information or a current update, and that's the dreaded RFI letter, request for information.
Yeah, and and one of the things that in the digital age, we're so used to conversing via either phone or text message or email, and it's just all digital based. And for those of you that don't know, there is a federal law out there, a federal statute that actually, when you're applying for a license, if you have to submit an application for a license, the governing body must request all documentation in writing. So that means that the FAA can't email you. Now, would I love to change that law? Yes. Maybe because one of the issues that we see is it can take easily 3 weeks for a pilot to receive a letter for anything. And then and if you read the letter, it says you have 60 days from the date of this letter to get everything submitted to us. So what happens if a pilot never received the letter? Because I know things have gotten lost in the mail. What happens if they're out on a trip and they are like, I can't get to the doctor in time to get even this information? What do they do?
I'll answer that question, but I want to mention something about the RFIs, because it's part of that question that we've discovered is adding to some of that. Like, once we had the portal available for AMEs to upload documentation electronically over a year ago, that increased the efficiency at Oklahoma City to process that initial certificate.
Okay.
But at the same time, if there was an error in that documentation, or if they couldn't attach a PI number to it, or if there was missing documentation, that basically meant an RFI letter is going out, and the letters are crossing the mail. Airmen might be sending it in, or AME might be uploading it after the fact. So then that's automatically a delay, like 6 to 8 weeks right there for us to relook at that case. So this gets to your question, though, because we've always had that issue with, what do I do if I get this letter or I haven't seen it? There's legalese in there that says if you don't respond within 60 days, basically if you call Oklahoma City or AME calls on your behalf, they'll give you more time.
Okay.
We completely understand what happens. And sometimes it's waiting to get that specialist to provide us a specific comment on something too. So.
Okay. With that, is there a standard, for instance, like is it if you call, is it an automatic 30-day extension, or do you say, hey, listen, I can't get into my specialist until this date? Is that how that works, or just to give people an idea of what would happen?
I think it's up to the analyst and the airman just requesting what time that is.
Okay.
I don't think they put a time limit on necessarily.
Okay. All right, great. Because I know that there have been a few pilots that have called in there, like they get the letter from the attorney saying, you now are required to submit your medical to us and return it, and we'll let you know when you can have it back. So, and for a pilot, that is very scary to get that. Nobody wants to be in trouble with the law.
Right.
So.
Al, if I might add to that too, I don't want to throw the FAA completely under the bus for the,
Right ahead.
for the RFI letters. Another cause, as Dan mentioned, was incomplete information. So doing that, but Dan brought up an excellent point about having the AME make a call if this documentation has come in. So people in this audience have heard me on my soapbox before. You really want to have a good AME who knows what he or she is doing, because if you go to the AME who just collects your money and issues a certificate, but isn't familiar with what's in the guide or is not willing to call the analyst at the FAA to explain on your behalf what's going on, then you don't really have an advocate, either the offices of Aeromedical or the AME, to get that paperwork done. And those people suffer by 2 or 3 months by not having someone who's willing to make that call. So I really plead with pilots, establish a long-term relationship with AME who's thorough and knowledgeable and will go to bat for you. And I think it would be the same thing in Canada as well.
Quay, you bring up a very good point with that. So the physicians that are on your staff are not AMEs, so they have no reporting requirement to the FAA, as far as confidentiality is concerned. Now, with that being said, can your AMAS physicians call on behalf of a pilot if they're working with your office as well, or is it only the AME that is allowed to call to get that extension?
We call routinely, again with the pilot's permission, because if we're submitting any case to the FAA, we have the written authorization to, but that opens up the window for an exchange of information. And we tend to use that for particularly confusing cases or nuanced cases, or perhaps something urgent, like someone is going to drop off the seniority list or lose their disability, or other things that are career threatening, where we really need a quick intervention.
No, that's great. So, well, Dr. Daniel, could you tell us then, how does that, can you, let's say, do the RFI letters that happen in the US, do those go out in Canada as well?
Well, they do, yeah. Okay. And analogous to the FAA, we upload everything on a secure portal.
Okay.
So everything's fully digitized.
Oh, so you're there. We've got some work to do then down south. That's great. So then you are not bound by snail mail?
No, as a matter of fact, they even email the pilots now. It's a mandatory field in the application. So the pilot gets a copy and I get a copy digitally of any follow-up letters.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So do you think that is, well, I guess let me ask you this then. Are there any other initiatives that you're aware of in Transport Canada where they're working on to better streamline the whole entire process?
I think the most interesting thing that we've introduced in the last few years is we can actually renew by telemedicine. So a non-initial medical, once you do a medical in office, you're allowed to do 2 telemedicine, and we can renew via video. And issue a medical, and if you require an ECG, we don't do it. Unless there's a mandatory reporting requirement with contingent to issuing your medical, there's no documents required. We literally do it in 3 minutes online, and away you go. And we email you what's called a fit form, and you print that out and keep it with we have an aviation document booklet as opposed to a printed form like you have here. And you just paperclip it to that, and that's the equivalent to a stamp or a signature.
Wow.
Yeah. The validity period is limited to 12 months.
Okay.
And if you're over 60, it's 6 months.
Okay. Well, that's great. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, are you taking notes? So, Dr. Janczyk, I'd like to ask you, we talked a little bit, or just mentioned briefly, the FAA mental health and the ARC and changing to medical certification. And that was announced in December 2023. Could you talk about, and it just recently concluded, for those of you that don't know, the ARC is a very fast-moving process. And could you talk about why that was formed by the FAA? What brought it to the forefront?
I think what brought it, well, there were a lot of things obviously that brought it to the forefront in terms of trying to just update policy changes, but my understanding, one of the events leading up to that was the Horizon Air mishap or incident that I think, again, brought, but we've had things previous to that as well in the past 5 to 10 years as well.
Yeah,
Just a
yeah.
culmination.
Yeah, and absolutely. And there was a mental health arc that the FAA put together back in 2015 after the Germanwings accident. That was the initial start of it. And then, could you tell us some of the major changes or what has happened regarding, because part of it was changing medical certification, the whole entire process. I don't want to say that the system is broken, but it's definitely not able to keep up with the capacity of pilots that are incoming. It's not keeping up. There's just so many extra pilot applicants that are coming through the pipeline now that there's not enough staffing or budget or anything else. So could you talk about what some of those medical certification changes are, or that have happened, or what's on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, there was both. So part of what the ARC did was speed up some of the things that we're already in the process of doing. I mean, for example, for the MedExpress pilots being able to see a status update. Now, there's still a lot of things more we need to do with that. That came out 2 years ago. Then the portal for AMEs to upload documentation. There's still improvements on those. It kind of sped up some of the IT type of related cybersecurity things that we had to look at. That's still what's pending, like on the pilot side, to be able to do double authentication, to do additional things in a portal for that. But on like the actual condition side, it sped up what we did with the antidepressant release for additional antidepressants that are authorized. So it sped up the process for some of those things. And it also showed that we got to do a lot of research on a lot of other things. So there's a lot of to-do lists now, right?
So you created more work for yourself.
Basically, yeah. But that's what we were already looking at SMS, and trying to move away from a diagnostic system to an SMS safety-related system on the medical side. That's a big lift that's been already going on for years, and we're just trying to figure out other ways of doing it so that it doesn't take 10 years, right? 15 years.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Another initiative we've already seen and the FAA has implemented primarily with the mental health diagnosis is delegating by using these protocols and checklists that have been developed, delegating the authority to issue down to the AME. And so rather than requiring that at a higher level headquarters review, the AME now has the authority, and that greatly accelerates the process as well.
Yeah, so that part of what he's referring to, I had already had a policy update ready, like working for the last 2 years.
So you were ready to go.
The reason we couldn't release it even before the ARC was there started a lot of internal validation I had to do.
Okay.
Because there's new tools that we want both AMEs to use, community psychologists, community psychiatrists, and I've been trying to validate those, so it's sped up that timeline to validate those things.
Oh, that's great.
Because we need outside experts to help us in that validation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Danzig mentioned antidepressant protocol changing a little bit. Could you, I don't know, and maybe a quick show of hands, how many of you know that you could fly on an antidepressant?
We can't see.
There's about, 10, 15
Not
hands
very
that are
many
up.
hands, yeah.
Okay, so I guess my first question would be, Dr. Danzig, what are you doing to promote that piece of knowledge to the pilot group?
Forums like this, I mean, the springtime and the autumn are the biggest times we get a lot of invitations from collegiate aviation programs, so we're doing that as a way to promote. We've instituted a new type of grand rounds for AMEs, so we can get the word out to AMEs as well, so they can, right when they're seeing the airmen, they can tell airmen, don't stop your antidepressant, it's acceptable now. Because obviously the misconception is still out there that they can't fly if they're on it for special issuance.
And,
So
and I won't lie, this is a very small snippet of our pilot population because literally we have over 70,000 pilots in the union. So this is maybe not accurate, but some of them are better informed than others, but you don't know what you don't know.
Well, and I can use an analogy from the Air Force side. The Air Force made major updates in their mental health medical standards, and it's still, even 2 or 3 or 4 years later, individuals don't know that they can be on antidepressant and still serve. They think that we're not going to retain them in the military because of it, even for non-flyers, non-pilots. So yeah, it's just getting the word out.
Definitely. And now, Dr. Snyder, for you, could you tell us about some of the new variety of antidepressants that that pilots are allowed to take now?
Well, initially in 2010, it was limited to SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, of which there are 4. And then there was initial consideration for another category of medicine. The trade name is Wellbutrin, which was added in 2023. It was considered earlier, but because of the FDA putting on some black box warnings, the FAA withdrew that until a review showed that the population really wasn't at risk. That being said, that's limited to only the sustained release or the extended release rather than the short term, and Dan can explain the reason why. And then shortly following the ARC, but I know it was in the works before the ARC, we had a new category of medications. And so there are a total of 8 medications right now. And if you ask me to name the generic names, I can't do that, but Dan can.
No, but you could find it in the Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners.
That's right there.
Well, I'd be interested to know what Canada does, but part of the reason that timelines, so we had, when it comes to medication certification, for lack of a better word, but it's to make it a conditional medication for aeromedical purposes. We have to form a committee that includes a pharmacist, experts. We have an internal committee process that goes through these meds. Not only do we look at the condition might be there, but we're strictly looking at aeromedical side effects to make it through that committee. And then just like what he described with bupropion, it's the generic name for Wellbutrin,
Right.
there's elevated seizure risk depending on the half-life that's more related. So that we had to look at those things as well. So that process is independent of just looking at the condition for what you take the medication for. And then at the same time, that's an internal process. We also like to ask external experts to give their own independent opinion before we bring it up to the federal surgeon for recommendation.
Okay, all right. So, Dr. Daniel, could you tell us, are there any known approved medications, or do you keep a similar list that's approved or not allowed, or how does that work in Canada?
We do have a partially published list, but there's others, again, that TC has that I wouldn't be necessarily privy to. Not that they're actively withholding information, it just hasn't been published. But we pretty much mirror the FAA, so there are plenty of pilots flying on SSRIs. Again, the decision making is primarily made at the Transport Canada level on a case-by-case basis, but they have become very proactive, very empathetic. There are often reporting requirements required, so roughly every 6 months they'll need a full psychiatry report. That usually goes on for about 2 years. If the condition is stable and there's no dosing changes, they'll then often lift that restriction. But again, case by case.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Are there any, so with the FAA ARC, it was just specifically for the US, but we did there were some observers, international observers that were allowed to attend. Dr. Daniel, were you one, or do you know of any of the Canadian physicians that were allowed to attend as an observer?
No and no.
Actually, Tyler Brooks
Yes.
was
There you go.
a participant on the ARC.
Okay. So then with that, and I don't know if you have this answer or not, but do you know if any of the observations and with the participation that Dr. Brooks had, are there possible changes that are coming for Transport Canada or for Canadian pilots,
Yeah, I think those, similar to the FAA, they're already rolling out. Again, they're not published, but I do witness it by seeing cases that otherwise would have been flatly denied.
Really?
And they're being very careful and proactive to get you back to work. So my answer would be yes, in terms of are they implementing some of these progressive changes to mental health? For sure, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's great to see that we're moving forward, so that's wonderful. Is it at the speed we want? Probably not, but it takes a very long time to implement a movement like that. So, Dr. Danzig, I'm going to throw some numbers at you here, but there are 2 items in the FAA Reauthorization Act that just passed this past summer in 2024 that I want to ask about. There was Section 411, which is Aeromedical Innovation and Modernization Working Group. And then there was Section 413, which is the Medical Portal Modernization Task Group. Could you give us a brief overview of those two sections? Because that equates to money for you. So how are you going to implement those types of budget changes? Or what are you planning to do with that?
So my understanding in terms of what that is, a working group we have to form. Can't be any less than 15 members, not including the 2 co-chairs. But it's basically, the overview is to evaluate the FAA's medical processes. That's I guess the charter for it. But under that, they have, I think, 3 or 4 sub-specific charters. One of them is actually to reevaluate what our conditions in AME should or could issue. That's one of them. One of them is to evaluate our response to the mental health ARC. That's another one. And then, as you said, there's the second part of the charter, 413, I think. And that's actually going to be a subset of the larger individuals. And they're basically looking at evaluating the cybersecurity part, the portal, what are things that we could do better with that. But even of the 15, there's going to be, I think, of 10 or 11 individuals looking at just the mental health side of those part of the charter.
Okay. So, well, let me ask you, with the modernization of the portal, is that the portal that the AMEs upload to, or is it the one the pilots use?
Both, but mainly on the pilot side. That's where we have the most challenges right now on the cybersecurity that we need to improve.
Okay. So is it going to remember our previous visits from the doctor so we don't have to re-enter them?
Yes, one of the goals is after we get the double authentication thing cleared for that part,
Okay.
you could look at your past flight physicals and what you submitted.
Yeah. Yeah, right now, until that happens, and I guess maybe, what's the timeline for that to happen?
Don't have a good answer on that one, sorry.
So, how long is this budget good for? Well, let's talk about then, are you going to create a whole new portal? Is it just a redesign for the pilots to use? Or, because some of the questions on that MedExpress form are, for lack of a better word, outdated. Yeah, and I mean, and I believe that probably attorneys in the room would not like me to say this, but it probably gets held up in legal for some reason.
My understanding is that the development of the software aspect of the portal can go on independently of the changes to the MedExpress instructions, but we're in the bucket of window now for the 8500, the form itself, to make changes to the questions and instructions.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that process, it's a 2 to 3 year window, and we're in the bucket now to submit those changes because it has to go through different parts of aviation safety, the FAA, legal, to do those. But that's going to be independent of the cybersecurity portion of the portal.
Okay, all right. Well, I know that we are working on cybersecurity on our side as well, so no, that's, well, here's hoping that, I don't know, would you like to throw out a guess as to how long you think it would take? Can I put you on the spot for that?
No,
No,
I have
you're
to
like,
punt
no.
on that one.
No, I do not want to do
My
that.
boss might know, but she didn't tell me. So.
No. So let me ask you this, Dr. Snyder. Could you talk about any recent trends, and this could be positive or negative, that you've seen as far as in-pilot health issues? Like, for instance, what do we need to be aware of to avoid medical disqualification? I know a lot of cancer trends are on the rise right now. That's been in the news recently. There's also a few different cardiac issues that have popped up. There's different knee and ankle injuries that are popping up due to the rise in pickleball. Yeah, So for those, I've heard it's a great older person sport. But I mean, what are you seeing come through your office? Are there any changes that an increase in trends or change in trends?
There are 2 that really stand out to me. Most of the common underlying pathology is still common and at the same rates: heart disease, cancer, orthopedic injuries, kidney stones, the whole spectrum of those. 2 areas where we're seeing increases, one in a positive way and one in a negative way, is encounters with mental health professionals. And I think the recent trend of education that the FAA has gone through, the visibility of mental health, that's perhaps the silver lining of COVID, that people recognize that this is a true issue, and Mental health is just as important as physical health, if not more important. So we see more people seeking help for that. Some of the AMEs aren't as spun up on some of the changes that they might be, and so the pilots are facing some deferrals. But the best part is the pilots are getting help in that. That's kind of a plus and minus a little bit. They are getting the help, and once the AMEs get fully educated as to the authority that FAA headquarters has given them, I think that'll be a strong positive. The big negative we're getting, which unfortunately disqualifies a pilot not only with their medical, but also results in revocation of their pilot certificates and ratings for at least 1 year, are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol positives from pilots who say, I only use CBD. But CBD, cannabidiol, is not regulated in the US. It's supposed to have less than 0.3% THC in it, but there's no guarantee that that's the case. So if someone were to use what they believe is a CBD product that is THC free, but subsequently test positive, that's not an excuse at all, and it'll be considered a violation of the DOT regulations, and that results in revocation of the medical, pilot certificates and ratings, a minimum of a 1-year period before they can go back and apply for their private pilot cert, or their student, their private, their commercial, their instrument, their multi, and their ATP. So that's a very, very serious career consequence. And it jeopardizes their job because in many cases they'll be terminated since they don't have a pilot certificate anymore. So for the pilots out there and for all of those that you talk to, my strong, strong recommendation is it is not worth risking your career on something that may jeopardize that because you think it might work. And oh, by the way, there's no scientific evidence that it works for anything besides pediatric seizures, a certain type of that. So please stay away from that, even if you go to Trader Joe's and things like that. It's just not worth the risk. But we're seeing a spike in those. The other thing we see is, but it's more we hear about, we're not seeing it in our pilots, is a lot of the youth have had ADHD in the past, and people needing to explain or refute their prior ADHD diagnosis through the testing process. But that's a little bit of increase in the ALPA pilot population, but from what I hear, it's more in the people who aspire to become airline pilots.
Yeah, the younger generations that are starting to apply. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I've always been informed that it CBD and THC, CBD is not federally regulated as far as in Canada, THC is regulated, it is legalized. But one of the things with CBD oil is that it is considered a dirty drug because you can have 1 bottle or 10 bottles come out from the same pod, we'll say, or and it will literally every bottle will have a different variation of amount of the percentage in there, and it's supposed to be all the same, but it's not. So that's one of the things that you just can't govern. That you can't regulate. As you said, it's not worth it.
Yeah. If I could follow up on that too, and James can talk about the Canadian regulations, but in the U.S., as you mentioned, THC is a federal prohibition right now, or at least it's a Schedule 1, Schedule 2 drug, I think. So it's prohibited. Many states have legalized it, but we fly under federal regulations. So despite whatever your state regulation is, it's prohibited for all pilots to use. And I just want to remind people that state regulations are subordinate to the federal regulation that we fly under. And James, you can talk about the policy for
Yeah,
THC
I mean,
in Canada.
there's technically a 28-day non-use letter you'll get, although they basically don't want you to touch it at all. More interestingly is your employer will be the one that has a more harsh zero tolerance contract. So your employment contract will likely supersede what is accepted by Transport Canada. And a lot of random testing, particularly when I flew in Europe. There was a lot more testing that went on there than Canada. But just circling back to some of the trends we see, as Quay stated, same sort of pathology, but what's really exciting and interesting, along with the mental health conversation and treatments, is some of the new generation of drugs over the last decade, the biologics. I think have really been game changers for pilots. Good example is Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. These are like really tough, challenging diseases to have as a pilot. And they've really been disease modifying some of the medications they're on, an IV every 6 weeks. And their lives, they just go on as though they don't have rheumatoid arthritis. So it's really exciting to see some of these new generation of drugs that are very positive, that are knocking down these symptoms and improving quality of life quite dramatically. Stents are a great thing, getting people back after a heart attack or a acute event fairly quickly. I don't know what it's like here, but 3 months back to work is pretty quick for a cardiac event.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
So, yeah.
So, no, and the research is out there now too. We've had enough of a, history with different things. We have a lot to go off of as far as for aerospace medicine. And, and I think one of the biggest complaints that pilots have is they're like, my cardiologist said this. And what the cardiologist may not actually be aware of is that altitude that we fly at impacts us differently than just if we were on the ground. So, that is definitely a concern for all of us. So, one last, I thought I heard somebody wanted to interject, and you're like, no. No. One last thing that I would ask is, what do you think, and I'll open this up to any of you, but what do you think a pilot could do to educate themselves as far as to take responsibility? We all would like a long, healthy career. You want to be able to go out on your terms of retirement. So what do you think a pilot could do as far as for education for themselves? Where could they go look? What would general recommendations you would make so they could avoid some of the common health issues?
Who do you want to start?
I think something unique to flying is sleep. It's just so underrated. It's a superpower, and I've become obsessed with my sleep patterns after flying professionally. And I think that is a nidus of a lot of problems. Whether we talk about sleep apnea, poor eating habits, the circadian flip-flops, it is devastating what a lack of sleep will do to your body, and inconsistent sleep. So I think that's a good one in everybody's world, probably in this room, to really focus on. And there's so many great tools, apps, your Apple Watch and various watches that give you that data. Super important.
Yeah. All right.
We were both exchanging our stories of becoming sleep Nazis after we studied this. So we're 8 hours of sleep a night person if we want to perform best. But other people have heard me talk about this book. I think ICAO has published an absolutely wonderful book that's very easily read. It's called Fit to Fly, A Pilot's Medical Guide. It's free if you download the PDF version. It has 9 chapters in it. One chapter is dedicated to sleep. We have one on nutrition. We have a chapter on mental health, on drugs and alcohol, on cancer, on circadian rhythm. I think it should be part of every pilot's library at every level, from student pilot on up. But if you don't have that in your library, you can read it at cruise between Chicago and New York. No problem, but it still has lots of good digestible information, and I strongly recommend it for those of you who are Googling it. Fit to Fly, and put ICAO Fit to Fly, A Pilot's Medical Guide. It's worth all the medical education, and actually that's one of the things we put in the ARC too, is that all stages of training and testing should incorporate knowledge about medical conditions too. So I think you'll see that evolving in future testing.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Dr. Danzik, any recommendations from you?
Yeah, definitely. I have at least two recommendations. One is, of course, as a psychiatrist, people often ask me at times, what can I do for myself to maintain mental illness? The first thing I tell people is take some time out of each of your day to do something for yourself, whatever that might be, and make that some type of habit. It doesn't have to be true mindfulness. I know there's a lot of apps now. My wife and I had bought a Peloton bike. I noticed you can do mindfulness things on that too, related. So it could be, but something that you disconnect from, your Apple Watch or your iPhone, everything else, and you just do something for, like, you're listening to some of your favorite music, but doing that on a regular routine basis is part of that mental wellness that we learn. The other thing I would say in response to what you mentioned is if you know, getting to preventative health, but when you do come with some type of symptom or symptoms that you're concerned about, being very cognizant not to go too far down the Dr. Google rabbit hole.
WebMD
Because that just actually worsens it, right? What we recommend at that point is, and instead of talking to your doctor friend or another pilot, you know, I mean, tell them about it, but don't seek medical advice that way. Actually go to and establish a relationship, if you can, with the same primary care doctor, that office, and get true medical advice that way. Because then that you're making sure preventative health is taken care of at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Google will tell you all kinds of things, and they may or may not be true.
All of a sudden, you've diagnosed yourself with 20 different
I
items.
think you have this rare condition, and it might be something that you just need to change something with your diet, and then alleviate something.
Yeah, absolutely. And nutrition, we had a nutritionist come and talk to our aeromedical group, and I was like, oh, I think I'm going to be changing my diet a little bit more. You know, all the fun facts that we learned there, so absolutely no. Dr. Daniel, let me ask you this, and then this will be the last question, then I'll open it up for the audience. But with the launch of the Canadian Aeromedical Support Program, how can a positive working relationship be established with Transport Canada as far as for really building up the medical support program that you'd like to, you know, you've got a goal, you've got a dream. What are you hoping to do as far as your relationship with Transport Canada? Because you work under them as a CAMI as well. So.
Yeah, that's right. I think collectively, with the ALPA hat on, I think Tim and his group have been really fantastic at building a relationship with TC, a communication channel to start off with long before we started the aeromedical program. And we're sort of making incremental gains, trying to convince them we're not threatening and that we're all in it together. And I think, you know, it's going to be a long process, but they have been very positive to meet with us and to work with us. You know, simple things like the information sharing where we can preemptively figure out what the standards are, order the tests that you need, and reduce their workload as well. So it's a lot of small steps over a long period of time, but it is moving in the right direction.
All right, well, thank you very much, doctors. I appreciate your time and telling everyone here about the great work that's moving forward and where we're going and what's up in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, look at you.